Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Dr. Ariel Cohen, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a recognized authority on international security and energy policy and a leading expert in Russia, Eurasia, and the Middle East. He's also a senior fellow at the International Tax and Investment Center, where he heads the Energy Growth and Security Program, and is the author of 6 books, the latest of which is Hour of Truth, The Conflict in Ukraine, Implications for Europe's Energy Security, and the Lessons for the U.S. Army. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Ariel Cohen.
It's a pleasure.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you're quoted in an article in The Guardian: Russia disinformation looks to the U.S. far right to weaken Ukraine's support. The Kremlin is deploying new tactics by drawing on favorite themes and conspiracy theories of right-wing Republicans. So I take it there's also 2 studies that are out that have looked into these issues, one at the Alliance for Securing Democracy and another at the Atlantic Council, where I imagine, were you involved in the Atlantic Council study?
No, I was not. That was done by other people.
Right.
But generally speaking, the Soviet intelligence work included something called disinformation. And I wrote my master's thesis at the Fletcher School a long time ago, 88, 89. And I also worked in the Soviet public opinion analysis for Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. So I'm not a stranger to these topics. And there's a direct line from the Soviet activity to today's attempts to influence public opinion all over the world, not just in the United States, as we saw in 2016 with Facebook and whatnot, but also you see now that in the developing world, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, a lot of times people are fed a steady diet of these messages that, oh, this is the white men's war. This is not of our interest at all. This is the Europeans trying to set something out. We don't care about that. And that opens the door for the Russians to continue their trade relations, to use, for example, grain exports as a blackmail tool to secure the support of African and Asian countries. And that puts us, the West, the U.S. and Europe, into a somewhat isolated position. It's not a horrible position, but I would much rather prefer for developing countries to recognize that Russian behavior is indeed imperialistic. It is destroying Ukraine. It takes Ukrainian territory, denying the Ukrainian nation the right to exist as an independent nation. And the information operations are playing a role here in this country and all over the world.
Well, just to finish up on the support for Russia's war in Ukraine in the global south, right next door in Mexico, there is also support from the president, López Obrador, and also in Brazil, its new president. Also, I wouldn't say they necessarily support Russia, but they don't support the United States and its position. What explains that? It's not about grain.
If you go back and look at López Obrador and Lula, these are people of the left, if not to say that. I wouldn't call Lula far left. It's people of the left. Their constituencies are anti-American, and they build upon anti-Americanism. Whatever America does is wrong. And they see our involvement in Europe and our support of Ukraine as some kind of colonialism or imperialism, which is, of course, wrong. We do not want to control the Ukrainian territory or the country. That's what the Russians want. But this is anti-Americanism, pure and simple.
So let's talk about the reason I called you, given that you quoted in this article in The Guardian that I mentioned.
Yes.
So Tucker Carlson seems to be playing an outsized role in influencing the American right to cut aid, particularly Congress, to cut aid to Ukraine. And my assumption would be that this is the best play that Putin has because he's not doing very well militarily, and the Ukrainians are preparing for a spring offensive where things may even get worse for him on the battlefield. So would you agree with that he must be using active measures over time to influence?
If Putin had an asset, a hypothetical, let's say Putin does have an asset in the United States, that asset would be articulating the Russian talking points. And, of course, I do not see any evidence that Tucker Carlson is directly connected to Russian intelligence. But let me tell you, some of the messages that Ukrainians are stealing our assistance money, and I am the first one to say, yes, we need to track the assistance money because we saw that billions of dollars went missing in Iraq and Afghanistan. I published a couple of articles saying that the future assistance to Ukraine should be transparent. We should have a bunch of accountants tracking that money. But today, when the war is going on, that is not the main point. Yeah, things should be transparent, granted, and they are. But the Russians are pushing that point that the money is somehow stolen, that Zelensky somehow personally benefits from this war. And there's no evidence for that. But Tucker and others are pushing that. There's another talking point that Ukraine somehow is a part of Russia. That's what Putin says. Putin says these are territories that were Russian, and Ukrainians are not a people. They don't have a right to exist. Well, let me tell you something. There was a Ukrainian national movement in the Tsarist Empire, and then when the Bolsheviks captured Ukraine after a short period of independence in 1918, they gave Ukrainians some amount of cultural autonomy, language, culture, etc. And after 80 years, 90 years, to say that it doesn't exist is falsifying history. And it's interesting that when Putin says that, there is an amen chamber here in this country on the far right that repeats it. Why do they do it? Who gets to Tucker's ear or to Trump's ear and now to DeSantis' ear? I have no idea. But let me tell you, some of the people on the right that I know and I worked with when I was the head of Eurasian Studies at the Heritage Foundation, they do not see things that way, but they're no longer with the Heritage Foundation. They quit when the current president of Heritage voiced the Tucker-like position on Ukraine and said that we should not support Ukraine.
So you're in a position then, Dr. Ariel Cohen, I imagine you've tried to figure out why they think this way. So why do they think this way? And you know, this is particularly coming from the Republican Party, which, you know, Ronald Reagan has to be turning over in his grave.
That's what I said. I said Ronald Reagan, who saw both the communist ideology and imperialism as evil forces, and was the leader of U.S. and West engaging the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world in Central America. We supported the Contras. Now, there are different opinions about how we supported the Contras, but Reagan understood the American role as the beacon of democracy, freedom, free markets, and liberty. The far right today is very cynical about that. They gave up the Reagan ideology, or for that matter, that ideology goes way before Reagan to the British philosophers of the Enlightenment in the late 18th, early 19th century, Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, and others. Now, I don't want to throw epithets and call people fascists, but the far right today is directly connected to the America First. They call themselves America Firsters, but America First was sympathetic to Franco. You remember Pat Buchanan, who grew up in a family of Franco sympathizers. Franco was a general in Spain, Francisco Franco, who fought and won the civil war in Spain, being supported by Hitler and Mussolini. So the far right has very dubious roots, and if they had their druthers back in the 1930s, the U.S. would sit out World War II. In fact, I had somebody writing to me on Twitter yesterday saying we supported the wrong side in World War II. Basically, a man was a Hitler supporter, and I banned him. But this is a dangerous, dangerous trajectory for the U.S. And what Mr. DeSantis did, mistakenly in my opinion, he divorced Putin from China, from Xi Jinping. In fact, on the 4th of February 2022, Putin was in Beijing for the Olympics, and China and Russia published a declaration of, quote, unlimited friendship. What does that mean? That's a declaration of a geopolitical axis. Who that axis is directed against is directed against the United States and against our allies in Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. And we see the Chinese are pushing. Just recently, they brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Putin is going to Russia to try and Xi is going to Russia to try and broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine. I think he's going to fail, but not for the lack of trying. So the effort by Moscow and Beijing, as I argue in a number of articles published in The Hill and elsewhere, is to tilt the balance of power in the world, and this is an axis that is directed against America and our interests in Europe and elsewhere.
But Tucker Carlson is not just spouting Kremlin propaganda. And by the way, Russian state TV runs his programs and clips of him regularly. He's actually playing a hands-on role. He sent out a questionnaire both to Donald Trump and then to Ron DeSantis about Ukraine. And that is what prompted DeSantis to go on the record. And it's a written record, by the way. He wrote back, filling out Tucker Carlson's questionnaire. And again, most of what he said is Russian talking points.
Well, that's a scary thing. Unfortunately, with our educational system collapsing in this country, people don't study history. And frankly, the stuff I'm talking about is a result of 30-plus years of my study that involved master's and PhD in Russia, international security, etc. So this is not something you pick up, on in a TikTok video or on Twitter. And Russia goes back hundreds of years, defining itself in opposition to the West. First, against the Catholic Europe, then against Catholics and Protestants. You have Ivan the Terrible complaining bitterly about Elizabeth I. We're talking 16th century. And then Nicholas II refers to Queen Victoria and said, the English woman is spoiling everything. These are quotes. And then, hatred of America under Stalin. And when Putin grew up, when Putin was a young man, a budding KGB officer, the brainwashing in the Soviet Union was tremendous. I lived there as a child. I remember that very well. Hatred of America. This is pretty much on the level of George Orwell's 1984. But what happened? It was so much that a lot of people understood that these are lies. A lot of people were listening to American and British foreign broadcasts, BBC, The Voice of America, etc., Radio Liberty. And in the end, the communist ideology collapsed. We are in the very beginning of this circle vis-a-vis Putin. But Putin has enablers in this country. That's tragic. We know in Germany, the influence was so huge that they, year after year, decade after decade, dug the hole that they were in terms of increasing their dependence on the Russian gas. Instead of diversifying their energy economy, they bought more and more gas from Gazprom, and then they became more and more pliant and not standing up to Russia while emasculating their military. So clearly we don't want to be in the same situation, especially that even the right understand the threat that's coming from China, but Putin today is a junior partner of Xi Jinping, and we need to remember that.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Dr. Ariel Cohen, let's talk about how you disabuse the far right of their affection towards Putin. I'm not sure what you can do about Tucker Carlson.
I would like somebody to look into Tucker and try to understand what are the motivational factors in his pro-Putin position. But more broadly, I think what people are missing on the right and in general is what kind of Russia Putin is presiding on. This is a Russia with one of the highest levels of HIV infections in the world, probably the highest in Europe, one of the highest levels of divorce, low levels of church observance or religious observance. This is not some kind of a bogus defender of Christendom and the white race that some on the right believe Putin is. He isn't. Putin's immigration policy are welcoming Muslims from Central Asia, people of color from as far as Bangladesh and Afghanistan. Go to Moscow, see. Third of the Moscow population are Muslims. So this is not a model you want to follow, and especially for people who care about free markets. Russia is far from being a free market. It's a corrupt dictatorship run by Putin's Secret Service and Mr. Putin himself. And that's it, folks.
Well, that didn't stop, though, Stephen Bannon on his War Room podcast in February of 2022, where he had an interview with Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater. They both enthused about Putin's policies of being anti-woke and praised Putin's homophobia and transphobia.
Well, again, this is politics. People build narratives. I met Steve Bannon. I don't think Steve Bannon is... how should we put it? I don't think Steve Bannon necessarily believes in everything he says. People play politics. People push narratives. And I think it's vastly unfortunate for the Republican Party that the two leading candidates, Mr. Trump and Mr. DeSantis, now appear to be in the position of appeasing Russia, appeasing Putin, the man who kills his political opponents in cold blood like he killed my friend Boris Nemtsov, the opposition leader, murdered in 2015, and I warned him not to go back to Russia, and he didn't listen to me. But people fall out of windows, people get poisoned, like Alexei Navalny, who just was featured in an Oscar-winning documentary. This is not a kind of regime you want for this country, or do you? And if you do, you're a clear and present danger for this country.
Well, Dr. Ariel Cohen, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to get more content like this.